welcome to the Fire and Police Commission meeting for March 28th of 2024. And we're going to call this to order at 4 p.m. exactly. Ms. Clerk, can we conduct a roll call?
Commissioner Herlinger,
Present.
Commissioner Jones,
Aquí.
Commissioner Rodriguez,
Here.
Chair Dozer,
Here.
Vice Chair Hill.
Present.
Ms. Clerk and Commissioners, are there any changes to the agenda? Hearing none.
Chair Dozer, there is a change to the
Oh.
agenda. We are pulling item 4B from the consent agenda, approval of the private patrol operator permit for Simply Safe Security Company, and that will be heard at our next meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Item 4, consent agenda. Item A, approval of private patrol operator permit for Cornwall Security Services, Inc.
Okay. Are there any public comments on this item? Any questions on this item? Would we like to approve this item?
I move to approve the consent agenda.
I have a question.
Commissioner Jones?
What is this for? Sorry.
It's approval of a private patrol operator.
Well, I got that.
Permit.
But what is is this like something that comes up annually, or I'm just kind of curious, what's the use, what's the purpose of it?
Commissioner Jones, this is a new applicant. Again, all of these patrol applications come through the Fire and Police Commission. So the staff recommendation is to approve this applicant. This is part of your quasi-judicial duties. And they do come up for renewal as well. And then there are applicants that go through a process where the staff recommendation is to deny that applicant. All of those come through the commission.
So this is an existing,
This is new.
this is a new permit. I guess I'm curious as to what the security services will be used for.
Yep, and we can absolutely have the applicant come up to respond to those questions. Yeah, Jocelyn, do you want to speak to? Yeah, Jocelyn, go ahead. Yeah, I apologize, I did not see you behind me. Yeah.
Good afternoon. So this is a new application for a private security company. We just do the initial approval. Every year, they will renew with the police department, as long as there has been no change since the first initial approval. I can't go into what areas they will be employed as, but they're private security. They could have multiple businesses or private clients that they will work for.
Okay. All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Appreciate that.
If I may too, I think Chair Dozer, Commissioner Jones too, I think one of the questions, if I may, you're trying to kind of get at what would be the purpose of the commission's purview on it. We're not checking in terms of the code we're supposed to look at. We're not checking in terms of whether their history or their level of operations in terms of how efficient they are. The main concern or purview is whether their uniforms are closely related to other local law enforcement agencies like the Santa Barbara Police Department, the Santa Barbara Sheriff's Department, et cetera. And the purpose for that is the reason why we want private patrol operators to have distinct uniforms is a public safety issue. We don't want them to be confused with law enforcement, and that's a protection for the public. And so the commission is there, too, as a body of individuals. Not only, it says 2 levels of review. So the police department review to make sure they don't are distinct, but it's also the Fire and Police Commission's view as essentially volunteers of the public to look at these two to ensure that, yes, they're distinct and there's not a safety issue for it.
Got it. So if I'm understanding you correctly, I don't want to take up too much time.
No.
For any private security entity that wants to operate within the city of Santa Barbara, it has to go through this approval process after it's been vetted by
Correct.
law enforcement.
That is
Okay.
correct.
So it's not like law enforcement is contracting with private security for something?
No,
other than
this is someone like,
private usage.
they could do private security for a bank, for a mall, whatever it may be, but in order to work in the city of Santa Barbara, there's certain requirements, and one of the requirements is that they be vetted by the police department and the commission to make sure their uniforms, their vehicles they use, jackets they wear, anything they have in terms of those type of tools are distinct and it won't cause confusion that they are local law enforcement.
Got it. Thank you for clarifying that.
With that additional information, I would move to approve the,
I have a comment, though. I have a comment on that. So I noticed that there isn't any information noted on the vehicle. So is vehicle going to be used? There wasn't a description or photo attached. Okay, super. And just to provide a little bit of history, last year, the commission, I don't know if it was amended anywhere, but we voted to make sure that the word security was listed on all of the uniforms. So that's an example of how this particular body had some decision-making authority over uniforms.
All right, I believe Commissioner Hill has made a motion to approve.
Second?
There you go. Thank you.
We will go ahead and vote.
Thank you.
We are waiting on 2 votes. Make sure you submit.
It was locked.
Waiting.
There you go. I think it has to be blue, I'm guessing. I think so.
Perfect. Motion passes.
Great. Can we now move on to the next agenda item?
Item number 5, general public comment.
Do we have any cards for public comment or anyone online?
Chair Dozer, we do not have any in-person or online public comments.
All right, will you read the next agenda item?
Item number 6, approval of special meeting minutes from February 21st, 2024, and meeting minutes from February 22nd, 2024.
Is there any public comment on these 2 items? Commissioners, do you have any comment? Do we have a motion to approve both of these
I
minutes?
make a motion that we approve the special meeting minutes and the minutes of February 22nd.
I'll second.
We will go ahead and vote. Motion passes. Item number 7, Santa Barbara Police Department Use of Force Annual Report.
So before I turn this over to Commander Corbett, I just want to take a moment. I think what you are going to see in this report is a continuation of what you saw last month in terms of our community accountability. We tried to make sure we provided the additional info that we had discussed last year when we gave this report in terms of, I believe it was Commissioner Dozier that asked for some more information regarding officer injuries. So we have added and taken the comments that we got after last year's annual report into consideration as we prepared this. So if there's additional when we come to the end, we're all happy to discuss that. But we did try to incorporate the different pieces that were brought forth and include it in this after last year's. I do want to take a moment to, today's been a great day. We got to swear in some new police officers that graduate from the academy tomorrow. So thank you for that. And, in the what we've been striving for, a lot of local, homegrown officers coming into the department. So just want to take a moment while I have it to appreciate that and emphasize that and, say thank you for those of you that attended earlier. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Commander Corbett.
Hi, good afternoon, Chair Dozer and members of the commission. So I'm going to go over the policy, a few of the sections, as I did last year, and then some of the data and information. So the Santa Barbara Police Department use of force policy falls under policy 300. And 300.1 states that the Santa Barbara Police Department's highest priority is safeguarding the sanctity of life, dignity, and liberty of all persons. Officers shall demonstrate this principle in their daily interactions with the community they are sworn to protect and serve. Section 300.3 states officers shall only use that amount of force that reasonably appears necessary given the facts and the totality of the circumstances known to or perceived by the officers at the time of the events to accomplish a legitimate law enforcement purpose. I've included some of the factors that are used to determine the reasonableness of force. There are several more, but what I've included here is the apparent immediacy and severity of the threat to officers and others, the effect of suspected alcohol or drugs, the conduct of the individual being confronted as reasonably perceived by the officer, individual's apparent mental state or capacity, officer subject factors, including age, size, relative strength, skill, injury sustained, and proximity of weapons or dangerous improvised devices. Within the policy, we have de-escalation and alternative tactics. As time and circumstances reasonably permit, and when the community and officer safety would not be compromised, officers should consider actions that may increase officer safety and decrease the need for force, requesting additional resources, formulating alternative plans with responding officers before entering an unstable situation that does not need immediate intervention, or employing other tactics in order to increase safety and reduce risk. On a 2-year cycle, all officers and sergeants are required to attend regular training, which we spoke about last month. And part of this training is in use of force tactics, which includes de-escalation, bias-based policing, and crisis intervention training. In February of 2023, Chief Gordon implemented a de-escalation flag. In 2023, since that time, 458 calls have been flagged by officers as having used de-escalation. These are 458 calls that did not need force, and de-escalation was utilized. We also have within the policy a duty to intercede. Any officer present and observing another law enforcement officer or employee using force that is clearly beyond that which is necessary, as determined by an objectively reasonable officer under the circumstances, shall, when in a position to do so, intercede to prevent the use of unreasonable force. So what is considered a use of force? We have several topics here on the left that we consider uses of force. Control holds with subject resistance, leg restraints, utilizing a wrap device, and that picture that you see up there is the wrap that we use, and that's when we have a combative or a violent subject that we need to put in a safe position for both his safety and the safety of the officers. A takedown, strikes or kicks, OC pepper spray, impact weapons or batons, tasers, extended range impact or less lethals, a canine bite or a firearm. As you can see on the right, which has these categorized, we had 93 total uses of force in 2023. The majority of those which were either takedowns or wraps. So on this next slide, I put up both the 2022 data and 2023. And as you can see, with the exception of the wrap, which had a slight increase, every category had significant decreases. There are factors that lead to reduction in use of force, and under Chief Gordon's leadership, we have increased field supervision, and that is we have sergeants in the field, as we have lieutenants in the patrol division now with sergeants that are in the field with the officers. Emphasis on training on de-escalation techniques, increased overall training, utilization of specialized units, and an established culture of community caretaking that permeates the entire department. So out of the 47,232 calls for service in 2023, there were 93 incidents of force. That means that 99.8% of the time did not result in force being used. The slide on the right, or the right side of the slide, shows the breakdown of the use of force by race. And this is for the subject. So as requested last year, we have included under our use of force details the categories of injuries for both subjects and for officers. We categorize these into four categories: no injury, a complaint of pain, meaning there's no visible injury, a minor injury, such as an abrasion, a puncture, or redness, or a serious injury with broken bones, requiring surgery, extended hospital care, or for the officer injuries, ones that require them to be out of work because they're too injured to report to work on their next shift. So for subject injuries, we had 49 that were no injury at all, 8 complaints of pain, 36 that are categorized as minor injury, and 0 serious injuries. Under the officer side, it's per incident, because some incidents there are multiple officers involved or multiple officers that are injured. So per incident, we had 43 incidents with no injury for officers, 13 under complaint of pain, 31 under minor injury, and 6 that are categorized as serious, meaning they resulted in at least 1 or more days unable to work as a result of that use of force and the injury sustained. So officer responsibilities after a use of force incident when they're on scene. First and foremost, once the scene is rendered safe, they provide first aid if that's necessary. They alert communications and let them know there was a use of force and request medical attention, additional officers, a supervisor, and CSI. They secure and protect the scene, provide statements to the supervisor that arrives on scene if there's one not already there, and prepare and complete reports as necessary detailing the facts of the use of force. When sergeants are alerted to a use of force, they respond to the incident scene. They ensure medical care for suspects and officers. They determine if more resources are needed. They ensure CSI is on scene to photograph, and they photograph even if there's no injuries as a result of the use of force. They interview suspects, officers, and witnesses about the use of force, ensure safety of officers and suspects, review all the reports, complete a use of force report, and notify the watch commander that there was a use of force. The Santa Barbara Police Department has a specific use of force reporting form that must be completed by all supervisors for every use of force incident. This form is routed from the sergeant to the commander to the assistant chief and finally to a community accountability to ensure a thorough review of every use of force incident at every level of the organization. Chief Gordon implemented a robust use of force review, and this was in the spring that we started using this form, the spring of 2023. I know this is very small, but the first 2 pages is just the instructions on how to complete the use of force review. It is a fillable document, which makes it easier for our officers and supervisors to complete, and at each stage it includes a complete review by the supervisors as well as the patrol commander, the assistant chief, and then finally to a community accountability. We're happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, is there any public comment on this?
Chair Dozer, we do not have any in-person or online public comments.
Thank you. Commissioners, questions or comments?
I request to speak.
Why are you not showing up here?
I should be. Why am I not showing?
Commissioner Hill?
A couple of questions while we figure out why the computer system isn't happy.
Just raise your hand. I'll do it.
Raising hands. So if you could turn back to the slide which had the use of force by race. So I guess I have one question there on the, we have the majority of the use of force cases involving Hispanic. And first question is this racial determination a perceived determination, or is this a determination based upon checking the credentials?
it's actual on, what they actually are on the use of force report. So this isn't what an officer perceives going into a situation, this is the actual race as reported by the suspect themselves.
Got it, okay, because when we do a stop report, they are talking about perceptions rather than the evidence from documentation. Is that correct?
When we talk about RIPA later today, we'll talk about how we report
Good.
what an officer's perception is, but this is based on factual, what a suspect says they are.
So then my question is, so we have, the majority of the cases involve Hispanic. Do you have any assessment of why that is the majority of the cases?
This is actually pretty in line with what our actual population here is in Santa Barbara.
Okay?
So, 56%, almost, 53 out of it. And I would also say that, yes, it is a majority, but when you look at the numbers, because of the smaller number of uses of force, it is not that actually, it is not like super, we look at these things, we want to make sure there's not a pattern, but it is not, there's not hundreds of difference between one versus the other. There's actually only 22 difference between, how many were for someone who was white versus how many someone was Hispanic. Because then, so there's not any particular pattern in these in terms of by race, but it is very actually in line with our population.
Is it relatively in line with the distribution of the calls for service?
We don't look at calls for service. We don't have a way to look at calls for service based on race. There's no
Got it.
way for us to actually make that comparison.
Okay, thank you. Another question is just because I don't know. What's CSI?
Crime scene investigators. So we have officers that are specifically assigned as a specialty position to be crime scene investigators. So they're specially trained to take evidence and take photos and all of that. So the officer that is involved in the use of force, and this is part about that transparency and delegating different duties so that there is the amount of separation. The officers that are involved in the use of force are not the ones collecting the evidence and taking the photos. It is a separate officer that does that under the guidance of the sergeant.
And could we turn to the page that's difficult to read? I guess it's the last, the use of force report at the end. Stopping at that page, are these available, these reports available for review by the commission?
No, because we would have to discuss what that could look like. These are not something that are, use of force reports are not public records, so we could discuss if there was something in particular that the commission wanted to review. The monitor, which is Ms. Anderson, has the ability to access them and review them and does go over them monthly with us.
Okay.
So there is another level of review when it comes to not just our internal review, but the review that is conducted by Ms. Anderson.
So if we have any questions, we could ask Ms. Anderson
Yes, you could.
to explore it further, if there was a reason to.
Yes.
I just note that there is, I love the fact that it includes a recommendation for accommodation for exemplary tactics and performance.
Yeah,
I'm
and
wondering
we,
how often that gets checked.
we actually have been very mindful of that in transferring to this new form in this process. We actually see a lot of times where there even may be force used, but it could have been, we've had a couple that could have been an officer-involved shooting where someone had a knife and the officer used really good skill and judgment and was able to use a lesser level of force through their actions. So those are ones that, just because there is force used, doesn't mean that we don't look at it in terms of the holistic picture of it. So there are a lot of times where there is a accommodation given because the officer really used extreme judgment and with the circumstances to de-escalate the situation. We've had a couple of, more than a couple that could have been really severe uses of force that were not.
Just the last one on this list, is there a determination or a place for a determination that the use of force was could have been less with harm reduction or
So,
use of those?
so if you look at the second box, it says supervisor's review of de-escalation strategies and tactics. So
That's
that
what
is something that we ask the supervisors to do on every use of force, is to look at that. So aside from whether it is in policy, we look at if there are other training issues or other things that we can address. If you look at the bottom, it also talks about, even if the force applied was in compliance with policy, it also then talks about debrief was conducted with the officers. So we want to make sure that the force was debriefed, which means the sergeant and the officers involved sit down and discuss what happened, what could have been done better, because as good as we do, there's always things that we learn from it and could do better. So that is the opportunity and what we encourage them all to do. And putting it on the form then ensures that supervisors are saying that, yes, they took this step and did this, and then our commanders are reviewing to make sure that it was done. But that is the big reason for that review of de-escalation strategies and tactics, is to make sure that, if we could have done things differently, that we are.
And stepping back from the questions, I just want to make a comment that this is an extraordinarily detailed and comprehensive approach towards the problem, and I'm very impressed with the way in which it is being analyzed and carried out, and it's obviously leading to good results in comparison to the preceding year. I assume this was not in operation in 2022.
This particular use of force memo and this investigation was not. This was actually started in the spring of last year.
Thank you. That's all my questions.
Commissioner Rodriguez?
Oh, just one second. I'm sorry. I apologize for interrupting Commissioner, Chair Dozier, Commissioner Rodriguez. I just wanted to make one point too, as the chief said, in terms of the records and what's allowable or not. The chief is correct. That's based on our own code, our own statute. It's 2.09050 when it comes to the access of records, and it says the commission shall have access to all fire and police department files and records allowable according to state law. So there's a basis for that on our code. So I just wanted to reiterate what records are allowable or not, and what our meeting code says on that as it relates to the commission. So
I'm
that's
sorry, I
it.
got a little confused in that answer.
Sure.
It means that as a matter of code, they are available?
They are not available. So my purpose in raising it was the chief says we can't share that per state law, and our muni code reflects that what the commission can have and cannot have access. So anything allowed by state law to be turned over can be reviewed by the commission. Documents that cannot be turned over per state law cannot be turned over by the commission.
That
So,
makes sense.
thank you.
Thank you.
Adding on to that, without requesting specific information, I think it might be helpful for the commission next year, when you do this report, to give an example of a supervisor's review for strategies and tactics for de-escalation, without having to go into full detail, because the stuff on the first page, the use of force memo, is very specific to that incident. But I think what this commission is curious about is, what are the teachable moments that an officer could learn how to use a de-escalation tactic. So that might be helpful for next year. My question is in regards to, well, first, let me just say, 98 use of force incidences in a year is phenomenal. And knowing that 99.8% of the time there is no use of force is very comforting, not only for a community, but also thinking about the safety and well-being of our officers, knowing that just 0.2% of the time there is a use of force. And congratulations on reducing use of force incidences by 37% in just 1 year. That's a big reduction. So I just want to acknowledge that. I did notice, however, though, that pointing of a weapon is not listed on the use of force numbers. Post recommends that departments add that as a use of force criteria, and it was also included in our audit recommendations last year. So I'm wondering if you can talk more about why that's not included?
So we're trying to still figure out how to do that. It's been audit recommendations for numerous departments. So we're still trying to figure out how to actually capture that, because it's not something that should have to be a use of force investigation. So we're trying to figure out the best way and trying to learn from others that are doing this. We thought we had a way with the way San Jose was going to do it, and they're still struggling with it. So we're just trying to figure out how to actually appropriately capture that piece. Because within that, if someone, let me give an example. Let's say that an officer, someone is in a stolen vehicle and there's what we would call a high-risk stop, and the officers point their gun at the individual who's driving that vehicle. It's not that it's not documented, because that's documented in a police report. So it's trying to figure out, because there will be times where, the officer will draw their weapon to search a building, but it's never pointed at an individual. So it's trying to figure out at what point that gets documented, how that gets documented. We have to find a balance with all the things that the officers already are documenting. We literally looked at doing study flags, and we don't have any study flags left within our Versaterm system to capture it. So we're trying to figure out what the best way is. We're trying to learn from what other departments are doing. We've had multiple conversations with Hassan about this, and we just haven't figured out exactly how we want to capture it. It's not that we're not going to, but we're trying to figure out what is going to be the best way to do that. And this is a process for us. We know it's a recommendation. We know we want to get there, but we're also trying to make all of the other changes we need to make. And we want to make sure that we're not doing something that has unintended consequences in terms of the amount of documentation officers are doing, and that is appropriate. And I also want to point out that this is not something that just gets swept under the carpet, because we're also doing body cam reviews, use of force reviews. There's a lot of other things that are happening to ensure that, besides, complaints, that we're not unnecessarily pointing our weapons at anyone as well. So this is a process. We have to figure out where that fits, how we can do this, how we can appropriately capture it, what is going to qualify, because there's a lot of discussion and over that, and not just within our agency, but like I said, in other agencies that have had the same audit recommendation. Mm-hmm. So it's not that we don't document it within a police report, but it's trying to figure out how we capture that and what we consider in terms of what we're capturing, mm-hmm. if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. I can understand the complexity of drawing a weapon, pointing a weapon. As an individual, if I saw an officer come in with their weapons drawn, to me, that would feel like use of force, whether or not it was pointed at me or not. So, and the likelihood of that drawn weapon, I would imagine, isn't going to be a de-escalation tactic. It's going to lead to an escalation of something. So
sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Mm-hmm. I will say that.
Yeah.
Sometimes that is that moment where it causes someone to stop and gain their composure, and then there can be talking, and the weapon can go away, and it can actually be de-escalated. So there are times where it actually is not always an escalation. Mm-hmm. So there are different circumstances where, just because of what is happening, an officer doesn't pull their weapon to de-escalate unless they feel that is, possibly where the situation is going. But there can be sometimes that will immediately change someone's behavior and de-escalate them. So we're just trying to work through how we capture that, what exactly we are capturing, so that we're very consistent with it, and making sure that we're creating a system that is something we can actually do and use, that doesn't become, when we talk about RIPA in a few minutes, you'll see there's great things that come with RIPA and information, but it is a lot of additional work happening by our officers on top of everything else. So we're just trying to find what that spot is.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. It's clear that it's complex, and I appreciate you taking your time on having that policy in place. I do want to share my personal experience with Santa Barbara Police Department last year when I did my ride-along. The officer I was riding with had a various number of responses that she could have used that would have been within the policy of use of force, and she used the most minimal amount of force possible, and that was an automatic reaction for her based on training and experience. And it gave me confidence in our department, and she was also safe in that circumstance. So well done, thank you.
Commissioner Herlinger.
I have a question about takedown. Does that mean that the officer physically touches and puts the victim down, or can they just say, "Get down," and they go down? Or how do you define that?
If an officer just asks someone to get down, that's not a takedown. That's where the officer physically assisted someone to the ground.
Okay.
And that could be a bear hug. That could be, something where we need to put them on the ground so we can control them, and then there's not an escalation of force. Sometimes it's very effective. That's one of the reasons that we use the wrap, because instead of continuing to struggle with someone who's combative and, then moving to strikes or something else, we try to do something that restrains them, but is also safe for them and a safe, proven technique. So, but yeah, a takedown is we, as an officer, actually put our hands on them and
Okay.
do that.
Commissioner Jones. It's not working.
Go back the old-fashioned way. Thank you. Can you tell me about the use of force review board, like its constituency and its protocol? Like, how does it go about doing its work? It's mentioned here on the sheet.
If it goes to a use of force review board, it's because of very serious injury or death to another. I'd have to brush off the policy, but it includes a supervisor, a peer, community accountability. I'm trying to think who else it includes on that. Yeah, we haven't had one in quite a while. I would literally have to brush off the policy. We've reviewed it, but I can't, quite frankly, off the top of my head, tell you exactly who sits on it. But it's in policy. It's several departmental. I think there's got to be someone from our use of force cadre on it. So it's several people looking at it. But I will tell you, since I've been here, we haven't had any use of force that have required a use of force review board because of serious injury.
Thank you. And then because it hasn't been utilized in quite some time, as you described, then to ask a question about the protocol or their process would be also dusting off the cobwebs, perhaps.
I can tell you if we have a use of force or a serious injury that requires a use of force review board, the whole purpose is that we're looking at all aspects of it and to ensure that we use appropriate tactics. There are things that we could have done differently. It's a whole review of everything. It's comprehensive. Goes back to that holistic review, making sure we're having other folks, have eyes on it, and that we're addressing any deficiencies if there are any, but it's standard procedure in any department. Typically, most of the time when you see this is when you have an officer-involved shooting. So the ones I've been involved with, typically from my prior agencies, I've been involved in these, is that when you're, as a department, analyzing an officer-involved shooting. So you're looking at all pieces of the officer-involved shooting, not just whether it was in policy or out of policy, but you're literally breaking down the whole thing to learn from it, to make sure that, like I said, if there's, tactics that could have been better, de-escalation, or the way we responded, what can we learn from it? Could we have done, medical care sooner? What exactly could we have done? It's a more thorough debrief at terms of the higher level of the department and different experts. But that is the purpose of it. It's really about the learning piece more than anything else, and determine, of course, whether it's in policy or out of policy. But the biggest piece of that is what we're learning from it moving forward.
Thank you.
All right, I'm just going to say, Chief, thank you for your leadership and bringing about some positive changes that are evidenced by these numbers, and to all your officers. Before we leave this agenda item, I would like to make a motion that the commission draft a public statement that is in regards to this agenda item, and I would also like to be able to consider and include last month's annual report on complaints and investigations And because this will take a little bit of time, I'm going to designate Commissioner Hill to prepare that draft and bring it back next month as an agendized item. Do I have a second?
Second.
Oh, Chair, can I speak as to that issue? I think it's important I speak. So I think
Yes.
thank you. One thing so just so the public who's listening, or just that, the commissioners kind of give an idea, one thing we've never kind of presented before, I think we need to do that, Barbara and I, on agenda items, is public statements from the commission. And so there is in the Muni Code, actual code that talks about public statements of the commission. And I'll just read it and then I kind of explain how procedurally it should go about so we don't run afoul of the Brown Act, and I'll explain why. So what that code section says is official communications of the commission shall be approved by majority vote of the entire membership taken at a public meeting. The commission, by majority vote of the entire membership, may designate one of its members to make official statements to the public. Other members may publicly discuss the role of the commission, the commissioner's public official business for educating the community, consistent with limitations of this section of the Brown Act. So what does all that mean? It means the commission can make official statements, as Chair Dozier said. Any official statements made by the commission have to be done by an approval of the majority. But the commission is not precluded to talk about having conversations or making statements about what the commission does, what their role is, stuff like that, is an educational piece. The issue, I'd like to do a full presentation with Barbara because there are thoughts and ideas of how the commission can do it to be highlighted. For example, how does it look like? Who does it go to? How is it recorded? For example, who can go to any official statement could automatically go to the city council and the city administrator, because that's who you advise. There could be a running log on the website of official public statements of the commission over the course, so the public can see that. Why I'd like to make the presentation and then your motion before it's approved on next week's item agenda is that the agenda described currently does not contain an action item. So I don't want to do that today so we don't run afoul of the Brown Act. What we plan on doing in the future and going forward in every agenda item is at the beginning, say for each item, the commission may make something to the effect of the commission may make a public statement pursuant to Muni Code 209 for each of these items. That way, the commission has the authority already there to do it on each item. Because we don't have that kind of little preamble in the beginning. I kind of want to wait for that next week. So if you could table that motion and allow us to bring the ability to make a public comment as to these items, and then anything moving forward, we'll do that, as well as Barbara and I will make kind of a quick, more detailed presentation of what this can look like to do that. Because that's one thing, we had such a laundry list and we never actually touched that item. So that's what I make a request. And why it's so important, because I'll give an example. Let's say there's an item not on the agenda, but the commission wants to make a public statement. I don't want that to be, not that this commission would ever do such a thing, but I don't want it to be used as an end around to deliberate on something not on the agenda. So what that means is, let's say we didn't do it on, let's say we wanted to make a public statement on something on a past agenda. We want to do that for this meeting. Well, since that item's not agendized, I don't want to have a discussion of it now because that can be used as an end around of the Brown Act. So let Barbara and I take care of that. What we would do is we'll put something in the beginning of each agenda to allow to do that. So even if it doesn't have action item description language, like this one doesn't, the agenda will always allow the commission to make a public statement. We'll bring this item back to designate who you want and what the public statement will be for this item and the previous one. So we'll put that on an agenda. And then we'll do a quick presentation of what the public statements can look like, how it can go procedurally, everything else, right? There could be a public statement where you don't need a draft, but an offer of support, right? And maybe you don't even need to do that. That can just be done orally from the dais. If it's a more detailed issue, we can go over that. So that's at least what I ask. And it's apologies, because that's something I should have brought earlier, because this is something in the code. And so this is something new for the commission and new for the commission to do. And I just want to make sure we do it correctly, just so we don't run afoul of the Brown Act. So we can do that next week.
So City Attorney Doimas, just so I'm understanding through all of that,
It is a lot.
are you telling me that we cannot put that on the agenda and start working on that until next month? What are you telling me?
To next month, at least to make a public comment, and I'll explain why. There's nothing on this agenda that talks about making a public statement. Here's what the item reads for right now regarding the use of force, right? Police Chief Kelly Gordon and Commander Casey Corbett will provide the annual report on incidents involving the use of force for the Santa Barbara Police Department. Nothing in that statement contains an action item for the commission to do. So that is my concern. But if we start putting on future agendas at the beginning, for each agenda item, the Fire and Police Commission can make a public comment pursuant to 2.09.060, then we're fine. Then I'm not worried about the lack of action item on that agenda. So that's why I'm saying, please hold that off for until next month.
Mr. Doimas, could there be a motion to start drafting a statement to be considered as an action item for next month?
Again, it's the issue of there's nothing in this agenda description that contains any action, so that, and it's just to be safe. So we will have that dialed in for next week in all future agenda items, so we don't run into this issue.
For next month, you mean?
For next month, I mean, sorry. It's been a long week.
There's no reason why any individual could not start thinking about this process.
Absolutely, yeah, of course. Of course. And we'll go in detail. So what I plan, for the plan for next month's item is, we will already have description language going forward on every agenda on the ability to make a public comment. We'll include a presentation as to how how that works. We never talked about that muni code and public comment. It's unique. It's the only board or commission that has such language in the muni code for them. I'll explain the genesis of it, why that was done, examples of how it could be done in terms of the process. And then we'll have a separate item as to the ability to go back and make a public comment on this issue, and it could be offered right then and there, and I guess there was another item you wanted previously to last month's item?
Yes.
Okay, and we'll make sure that is agendized dually as one item, and you can make
Well,
public comments.
if we're adding things, can I also add that it be tied in with our audit? Because the three actually demonstrate a pattern we'd like to comment on.
Sure, we can do that.
Right.
As long as it's agendized, absolutely.
All right, well, thank
All
you
right.
for keeping
Sorry
us
for
on
the
the
interruption.
legal
I
straight and
apologize. No,
narrow.
it's okay. Sorry for the interruption. Thank you.
Okay, let's move on. Ms. Clerk, can you please read the next item? I believe it's number 8.
Item 8, Background on Racial Identity and Profiling Act.
So as we move into the next set of educational material, so this presentation that Commander Casapis is going to be giving is the educational side of it, just to give you background on what we call RIPA. So you will often hear just RIPA. You won't typically hear the whole terminology. You know, we love acronyms, just like everyone else. But this is not going to give you specific statistics, so I'm going to preface that with what we see in our department. So we want to break them up because otherwise it's too much information. So we're going to give you the educational piece on what RIPA is today, and then next month we will come back with actually our annual report on what our RIPA numbers are. We want to make sure we also give you a chance to digest so that when we come back with the numbers, you also, have the ability to ask questions that are pertinent to ours once you understand what RIPA is. So bear with us while we give you the educational piece, and then next month we will come back with the numbers that actually are specific to our department. Okay.
All right, well, good afternoon, Chair Dozer and Commissioners. I appreciate the opportunity to present to you today on some background on the Racial Identified Profiling Act, also known as RIPA. As the Chief had mentioned, today will be a lot of background information, so we'll be covering a lot. Some of the stuff we'll cover in today's presentation will be the general background on RIPA, the data collection requirements. Some key definitions are important to recognize when determining whether or not we have to do stop data, what those data elements are, so what do we actually collect after a stop, the RIPA board, which came out of Assembly Bill 953, which is the origin of RIPA, and then also just a general summary of entity responsibilities. So there's agency responsibilities, there's responsibilities with the RIPA board, and also with post. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. So we'll start off with the origins of RIPA. So RIPA came out of the State Assembly in 2015. It was introduced by Assembly Member Shirley Weber out of San Diego. And as I mentioned, it was introduced in Assembly Bill 953. So RIPA stemmed from a national narrative, some national narratives surrounding some high-profile law enforcement incidents. And RIPA was presented as an effort to help eliminate racial and identity profiling by law enforcement. The goal of RIPA was to promote transparency, equity, and fair treatment in policing. It made its way through the Assembly and ultimately took effect on January 1st of 2016. So Assembly Bill 953 was a lengthy Assembly bill. It had a lot of information in it, but some of the key points that I wanted to share with you from the bill are the following. So Assembly Bill 953, in summary, modified the definition of racial profiling to include identity profiling. It also reaffirmed prohibitions against racial and identity profiling by law enforcement. It required law enforcement entities to report all citizen complaints alleging racial bias or identity bias. That's now in the Penal Code. It established a racial and identity profiling advisory board, or that RIPA board, which we'll talk about shortly. And it also required law enforcement agencies to collect and report data to the Attorney General's office on all vehicle and pedestrian stops. And I include that in a couple italic points there because for the law enforcement side of it, this was kind of the heaviest lift that came out of the Assembly bill for us. And so we'll talk a lot about that. So what are the data collection requirements? RIPA requires law enforcement agencies throughout the state, so any agency, to collect perceived demographic or other detailed data regarding pedestrian and traffic stops. And so I emphasize perceived because, as mentioned earlier, the foundation of our RIPA data collection is on officer perception. That's an important point that we'll talk a lot about today. The data is not to be collected from identification, but rather based upon the officer's perception of the person they stop. So oftentimes when we stop somebody, most frequently they'll have a California ID, a passport, some form of ID. We're not to then use the information on that to make those determinations. Again, they have to come from officer's perception. This information shall not be requested from the person stopped, so we shouldn't ask people for their identity or ethnicity. We don't ask people. And also, personal identifying information of the person stopped shall not be included in the report. So there's anonymity associated with this. In other words, we're not putting first names or last names, date of births or addresses. There is anonymity for the person whose data is being collected and reported. So the data that we collect, we call it stop data. And so what does that reporting look like? The reporting format was set by the Department of Justice. The actual form itself is referred to as the CJIS 2000. It's a 4-page form. And so later on in the slide, we'll see like an image of what the first page looks like. So it's a lot of data. So it's definitely, it has some work that's involved with it. That statewide data is collected and stored in a system called the Stop Data Collection System. And so we report annually. We actually just reported this month. And that all goes to a statewide system that then is looked at by the RIPA board for the production of a report. Numerous electronic reporting formats were created to streamline this reporting process. So as you can imagine, law enforcement were very busy, lots of reports to take. So now I'll use our agency as an example, hundreds of stops that qualify for RIPA per month, 4-page form per stop per person where that qualifies. That creates a lot of work. And so Santa Barbara Police Department, we utilize a phone-based application that's called Veritone to collect and submit that to the Department of Justice. And so what does that look like? For perspective, my general understanding is that officers now who do this frequently can usually complete that in less than 10 minutes. So if they have a stop that requires RIPA, that's about 10 minutes of work per person that they have to enter into that system. When RIPA was implemented, there was a timeline that was developed for implementation. And so the way that it was broken down it's broken down in 4 waves. The first wave, so agencies with larger numbers of sworn officers had to report first. And so that first wave would be agencies that had anywhere from 1,000 to 1,000 plus sworn officers. As you can see here, they had to collect their data by July of 2018, and they had to begin reporting April of 2019. The Santa Barbara Police Department, if you look at that highlighted section, we fell into wave 4. And so wave 4 was between 333 officers, that was us. we had to start collecting data by January 1st of 2022 and had to start reporting it by April 1st of 2023. And so we had the ability to report early. And so Santa Barbara Police Department, in the spirit of cooperation and being part of this and transparency, we actually chose to report early or collect early. So we started collecting our data in July of 2021, so about 6 months early. So a couple key definitions to be aware of when considering when WIPRA would be implemented. And so I'm not going to read all these to you. I'll let you kind of peruse those definitions, but I will hit on certain points for each of these things that I think are important for us to all know about. So I'll start with the stop. So in law enforcement, we do a variety of stops, right? I think the most fundamental would be a consensual encounter. That is basically a stop that an officer conducts where the person's free to leave. They have to provide any information. There's no like real legal basis for that stop. It's just a consensual encounter. A consensual encounter, for the purposes of RIPA, if there's a search that's conducted of either the person, their individual person, or of their property, that would trigger a RIPA reporting requirement per the definition of a stop for RIPA. I want to cover in the section definition of detention, focus on conduct by an officer that would lead a reasonable person to believe that they are not free to leave or disregard the officer's commands. And so what I want to get out there is that there's obvious detentions where we tell someone, stop, you're being detained, sit down, right? But we can create a de facto detention by action. So what that might look like is, we conduct a consensual encounter. Now 5 or 6 officers show up. We put spotlights on somebody. We create kind of a physical barrier, maybe inadvertently. Well, those all might lead to a de facto detention, which might trigger, even though we might think that started out as consensual, as something that would now have to be reportable through RIPA for that contact. And then for a search, a couple things to note for the search. So a pat-down search of a person's outer clothing would trigger a RIPA requirement, as well as a consensual search. So oftentimes we conduct what's called a Terry pat-down. It comes from case law, basically a cursory search of outer clothing just for weapons. That would then trigger a requirement for us to report to RIPA, as well as a consensual search. So even if we say, hey, do you mind if I search you? No, go ahead. They give you consent. We still have to report that data to RIPA. So reporting officer information. So with respect to the officer making a stop, what must that officer report? A few things. So the first thing they have to report is the agency ORI. So the ORI is basically the originating agency identifying number. That's a unique number that each agency in the state has. And so that's a way to correlate that stop to the Santa Barbara Police Department in our case. The officer's identification number has to be reported. So they don't give a name. We don't report names. But every officer has, it's commonly referred to as a badge number. For us, it's identification number that would associate stops with a particular officer. Years of experience, so how many years does that officer have on? And then also the type of assignment. So does that officer, I'll use our examples, is that a patrol officer, a detective? Do they work on our community action team? Are they a traffic officer? So what's their assignment? Throughout the years, there have been modifications or adjustments to RIPA or amendments. I want to hit on a couple from this year. So January 1st, 2024, there were a few amendments to RIPA that added required data elements. Those were race or ethnicity of the officer and also gender of the officer. And so I'll focus on gender of the officer. That data element was met with opposition by many large statewide police associations. Actually, legal action was taken against the Department of Justice. And the plaintiffs in that case cited provisions in law that prevented employers already from demanding gender identity from their employees. And so the way this was looked at is, hey, there are already provisions in the law that prevent this. You're now asking officers to provide this. That's a problem for us. And so this made its way to the Supreme Court in Sacramento. January 22nd of 2024, that Superior Court issued a temporary restraining order against the Department of Justice from enforcing reporting of gender of officer. And so that's still pending a preliminary injunction hearing and making its way through the court process, but I think that's important to note. So now getting to the data element. So what is collected from our officers on the form? And I mentioned later that CJS 2000 form, that's the first page of it there that you see in that image. I know it's relatively small, but there's 4 pages just like that. So what does that officer have to include there? So the first thing they include is the date, time, and the location of the stop. The location of stop, I want to clarify there, we don't put exact locations. So if we go to a residence, for example, on a call for service, we're not putting the exact numbers, or a business, not putting the exact numbers. So that's either the 100 block or the closest intersection. The reason for the stop, so was this a consensual encounter? Was it a call for service? Was it a detention? Was it based on probation, parole, known status? So we include the reason for the stop. The action taken during the stop. So what was the action taken? Was the person detained on a curb? Were they handcuffed? Were they placed in the back of a patrol car? So what actions were taken during the stop? Search information, that would be, did we conduct a search? Was that a pat-down search? Was that a full search? Was it a search of property? So what did that entail? And then what evidence was found? And then also what property was seized. So did we tow a car? Did we take something as evidence? What did that look like? And then ultimately the result of the stop. So what was the disposition of the stop? Did it result in a citation or a warning or an arrest? What did that look like? So now continue with the required data elements. With respect to the person being stopped, what does the officer have to report? So again, the officer must report their own perceptions based on observation only, the following details. So they have to list perceived race or ethnicity of the person stopped, perceived age, perceived gender, perceived sexual orientation, whether there was perception of limited or no English fluency, known or perceived disability, and whether or not the person was perceived to be unhoused. So a couple questions that we want to answer in regards to officer perception, because as you could tell, this is a big component of RIPA. So can the officer's perception be wrong? And the answer to that actually comes out of law surrounding this, and the answer is there's no wrong perception, but it must be the officer's honest perception. The government code actually has it codified where it requires us to record this perception data, so we're required to do this by law. And then also that same government code section prohibits recording demographic data seen on the person's identification card. So going back to a stop, just because someone has an ID or a passport or there's a way for us to look this up, we're going based on officer perception, not on what we know to be based upon those facts. So another question sometimes asked is when does that perception occur? And so the Department of Justice provides us with a definition for that. The selection must be based upon the officer's personal observation at whatever point in the encounter the officer is able to make such an observation. So this becomes important for a few reasons, and I'll use the example of a traffic stop, right? So if you're behind a vehicle and you watch it do some sort of infraction and you initiate a stop, you're not going to make this observation on that detention until you get to that window and the person rolls it down and you're able to see who you're dealing with, right? Or a call for service. So a lot of times we're responding to incidents that are called in by others. So our observations are not leading to that detention that's made or whatever that case is that leads us to collect this data. That's based on somebody else's information and calling in. So that's when the perception occurs. A couple other nuances to RIPA just to be aware of generally. So situations that are only reportable if additional action is taken, things such as traffic control due to emergency, crowd control for public safety, passengers in a vehicle. I'll stop on that for a second. So, frequently we stop a vehicle, there's multiple passengers. Do you now have to do a RIPA contact for everybody? The answer is only if you take actions that we've described that would require you or trigger you to have to do that. So it's not an automatic. Checking proof of age or a DUI checkpoint. So we have a DUI checkpoint, vehicles come through, we check IDs. We don't have to then conduct a RIPA for all those. That's an exception. And what's not reportable? Active shooter situations, bomb scenes or mass evacuations, and just general routine security. So those are rare instances where this is not applicable. So now just to kind of summarize responsibilities for various entities who are involved. So I'll start with the Santa Barbara Police Department or the agency responsibilities. So our responsibilities include collecting the stop data and reporting to the Department of Justice, reviewing and reinforcing best practices, including how to collect and maintain stop data. I'll talk briefly about that. Once a month, the Santa Barbara Police Department's leadership, so that's sergeant on up, including our professional staff, managers, and supervisors. We have leadership meetings. Last month's topic was RIPA, and we reinforce best practices in this on a regular basis to be in line with our agency responsibilities. Conduct supervisor review of individual stop records. Every single stop that's entered through that Veritone system goes into a computer queue. That computer queue has to be reviewed by either a sergeant, lieutenant, or a commander, so someone in a supervisor manager position. They're looking at it for accuracy to ensure that the details are correct. There's actually two portions with a small narrative there, so we read the narratives for accuracy as well. So there is an automatic supervisory accountability audit that occurs with each RIPA entry and stop. Implement audits to ensure data accountability. So we do that through that system. We also do something similar. So I think the chief had mentioned that we do monthly reviews of body-worn cameras. So every supervisor who has a team every month has to audit a random audit of their officer's body-worn camera footage. Part of that audit is to audit for bias-based policing. So we've implemented our own systems in addition to this to ensure that we're in compliance not only with RIPA, but best practice for law enforcement in general. Provide summary civilian complaint data to DOJ. That's in the penal code, we do that. Complete expanded training related to racial identity profiling. So we talked a lot about training, I think in the last presentation we did last month. A lot of those hours go to topics that would be applicable to this. That's also included in POST's general training calendar, their 2-year cycle. And then update agency policies and practices as needed. We're constantly looking at our policy. It's reviewed on a regular basis. When updates occur, we're doing them. And you'll see here in a moment, we actually have an entire policy for bias-based policing. So that policy would be policy section 401. And that policy provides guidance to department members that affirms the Santa Barbara Police Department's commitment to policing that is fair and objective. So that's the mission of this policy. It's a pretty extensive policy. I just put a couple highlight points here for you. So 401.3 prohibits bias-based policing. 401.4.2, now this is related to our requirements to produce data on the stops. And then 401.8, which is regarding training. So training on fair and objective policing and review this policy shall be conducted annually to include explicit and implicit biases and avoid improper profiling. So this is written into our policy, which we have section 401, which is solely dedicated to prohibiting bias-based policing. The next entity I want to discuss briefly is the RIPA board, so the Racial and Identity Profiling Advisory Board, RIPA board. This was created for the purposes of eliminating racial and identity profiling and improving diversity and racial and identity sensitivity in law enforcement, and that was codified in the penal code. That RIPA board is comprised of 19 members. Those 19 members are made up of community advocates, spiritual leaders, academics, attorneys, and members of law enforcement. And so they have a pretty expansive roles and responsibilities. These are just some of the highlights of them. So the RIPA board is responsible for analyzing the stop data and civilian complaint data on an annual basis. They also are tasked with working with law enforcement to review racial and identity profiling policies and practices. They review law enforcement training, so training that's either provided by POST or other trainings that are out there on the subject matter. And probably one of the biggest things that they do is they issue an annual report that details the data findings and provides policy recommendations and best practices to law enforcement when it comes to the subject matter. So that last page there was just the cover page of their 2023 report. That's almost 300 pages long, and so it's a very lengthy and comprehensive report. And the last thing I will talk about here is the role of POST. So you guys all know that POST is the Commission of Peace Officer Standards and Training, kind of the governing body of California law enforcement. We're a POST agency. We comply with POST standards. So POST's role in this would be to develop and disseminate guidelines and training for peace officers in California. They also would work in consultation with the RIPA board to develop evidence-based curriculum, and then also create training that shall prescribe evidence-based practices and protocols that prevent racial and identity profiling, and that's, again, in the penal code. And so it's a lot of information, but that's just a summary of RIPA for you. As the chief had mentioned, next month we'll come back and we'll actually discuss our department's RIPA data and information. So thank you for your time, and we'll open up for any questions or comments.
Thank you, Commander. Not only was that a great foundation for us, I just think it was really educational for the community at large to hear about that. Let me start. Are there any public comments?
Chair Dozer, we do not have any in-person or online public comments.
Commissioners, do you have any comments or questions? And please raise your hand. Commissioner Rodriguez.
Thank you so much for that, that background and report. I think it was 2016, Santa Barbara County conducted what they call the RED study, the Racial and Ethnic Disparity Study, and it was specific for youth, for juveniles in the justice system. And that study showed that, I'm going to get the percentages wrong, but I think it was Black youth were 5 times as likely to be arrested or incarcerated than white youth, and then Hispanic youth were 2.5 times more likely. At that time, I was running a restorative justice program for the county, and so I did my own informal investigation, and I contacted our police departments because I wanted to find out why were our youth of color having more contact than white youth. And what I learned was that the majority of those stops were calls for service. So it wasn't stemming from officers driving down the street and identifying youth of color and then stopping them. It was community calling police and saying there are, quote, suspicious activity taking place in a parking lot. So I'm really happy to see that on this report, there is a section for reason for stop so that we as a community can understand, was this a proactive, like police driving down, or was this a call for service? Because it lets us know if training needs to take place within the department or within the community. And the perception, I'm finding myself conflicted with perception versus bias. My bias training is saying, how are you going to identify someone's sexual orientation? So it'll be interesting to hear the reporting next month. This was a thorough and very clear and understandable presentation, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Commissioner
I have
Hill.
a question. So I'm just scanning the I'm scanning the executive summary of the RIPA board report for 2024, which is actually dealing with 2022 data. And I just even the executive summary is quite daunting, let alone the whole report. But it has specific data dealing with police contact with field interview cards being used. And so my question was, is that a process that's used in the city of Santa Barbara?
Yeah, so a field interview card, what is that? So when an officer makes a contact, they can do a couple things. They can write a report, which is a comprehensive report of the situation, generally a crime report. They can do nothing and just clear it with just a public contact. Or they can do kind of a middle ground step, which is called a field interview card. And the purpose of a field interview card is to collect data that would link that stop to an individual and to perhaps something that was going on. So stops are founded on the principles of reasonable suspicion, right, which is less than probable cause. So reasonable suspicion is basically you see something that you believe to be criminal behavior afoot, and you're going to make a temporary detention to determine whether or not that person's involved. Now, you might not ever reach the threshold of probable cause, but that might be something that you might want to record as something less than a report, and oftentimes that results in what's called a field interview card, or we call them FIs. In Santa Barbara, we have them labeled as street checks. So that's what that is. So do we use that practice? We do. That's very common throughout law enforcement, and that's kind of a summary of a situation that would be applicable to.
Is that information part of what we will see in next month's report of data?
We can look at that. We can definitely create a number for how many field interview cards we do. I don't know if that relation to the context of RIPA would give us any kind of conclusions that we can work off of, but that data exists. I just don't know how we necessarily would correlate that to RIPA in a way that would be, I guess, helpful to the commission.
Okay. Well, the only reason, I'm shooting in the blind here, so it seems like the RIPA Commission found that data so that they could make a report about it. So, and I also note that one of the things that is being commented on is the entry of that data into CalGang or other agency databases, which, in the absence of arrest, could lead to a probable cause in a subsequent transaction. And there's some questions about whether or not there's due process associated with that.
There's been a lot of controversy over the years, and coming from LA County, that was something that did occur in a lot of agencies there, where when you did a field interview, if you contacted someone that was identified as a gang member, that would go into the CalGang system. There's been a lot of, there's been court cases, there's been all sorts of different things surrounding that. That's not the way in which we use it here. So I understand where that's coming from in terms of the report. And I would just ask your patience while we have an opportunity next month to present our data independently of the entire state of California.
Right, and this was sort of just a heads up to find out whether or not, I mean, I assume when we look at your data, that's going to be very different from what we're seeing for the statewide basis.
Yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions, commissioners? All right, next agenda item.
Item number 9, annual AB 481 reporting requirement.
So again, good afternoon, Commissioners. I'll be providing you this annual report on our military equipment use per Assembly Bill 481 and Government Code Section 7070. So last April was our first report out on the subject matter. At that time, we provided a much more robust background in terms of the bill. For today's report, I'll recap some of that background just for general context for what we're going to present for 2023. Assembly Bill 481 was introduced in 2021, and it sought to regulate law enforcement agency funding, acquisition, and use of military equipment. Assembly Bill 481 became effective January 1st of 2022, and as I mentioned, was codified in the Government Code. The bill required law enforcement agencies to obtain approval from their governing bodies via the adoption of a military equipment use policy by ordinance prior to law enforcement funding, acquisition, or use of such equipment. On April 19th of 2022, the Santa Barbara City Council approved Santa Barbara Police Department's military equipment policy and inventory list. Pursuant to Assembly Bill 481 and the Government Code, an annual report is required for as long as that equipment is available for use by the Santa Barbara Police Department. This requirement, the requirement of an annual report and what we have to report on are listed in Government Code Section 7072. Today I'll provide you with a summary of our annual military equipment report to be in compliance with AB 41 and that Government Code section. So a couple things I want to talk about before we get into our report out. AB 481's definition of military equipment extends beyond equipment that has clear default to military use. Under AB 481, the term military equipment is more broadly applied to 15 categories. Of those 15 categories, we have equipment in 8 of them. The equipment that we currently possess in this inventory list is considered industry standard. And the vast majority of the equipment that we do have are less lethal platforms. So we use those to de-escalate situations that might otherwise result in higher uses of force, and also provide for the safety of the public, the person who's potentially committing a crime, and our officers as well. So I'll just transition to the first portion of our report out, which would be the equipment use summary for 2023. The first item would be our robot. So in 2023, we had 0 operational uses of our robot. Second would be our unmanned aerial system. We call that our UAS. We had 12 operational uses of the UAS system in 2023. The next items are armored vehicle. So we have 1 armored vehicle. It's an armored rescue vehicle made by a company called Lenco. It's called the Bearcat. And we used that in 14 operations or 14 operational uses last year. Our mobile incident command vehicle is the next item on that list. That's our command post. We use that for critical incidents. We also use it for emergency deployments such as flood details or other natural disasters. The mobile incident command vehicle was used in 5 operational uses last year. Next would be our 40 millimeter launchers and rounds. 40 millimeter launcher is a less lethal weapon platform that shoots a foam round. It also has capabilities of introducing chemical agent. And in 2023, we had 0 operational uses of that device. Our less lethal shotguns. So we have less lethal shotguns. They shoot, it's a basic shotgun platform. It shoots a tail stabilized beanbag round. It's a less lethal round. And we had 0 uses of that piece of equipment in 2023. The next would be our distraction devices. Those are light sound distraction devices. We had 0 operational uses in 2023. Rifles, we're all familiar with what a rifle is. There were no operational uses of our rifles last year or in 2023. Chemical agents and smoke canisters, we had no operational uses of either of those in 2023. Our pepper ball launcher, a pepper ball launcher is another less lethal platform. It's basically a paintball gun that uses compressed air to shoot a round that contains OC spray. And in 2023, we had 0 operational uses of that piece of equipment. Last on that list would be a breaching shotgun. A breaching shotgun is just a standard shotgun system. It shoots a special round that is designed to open doors that are locked or to breach doorways or other items or other objects. And in 2023, we had no operational uses of our breaching shotgun. A couple other things that Government Code 7072 requires of us, I'll summarize now. The first would be complaints or concerns received. There were no complaints or concerns received regarding this equipment in 2023. There were no reported violations of Santa Barbara Police Department Policy 707. That's our policy that's specific to military equipment and its use. The costs associated with this equipment are outlined in Section 707. We have an inventory there that we publish conspicuously on our website for all to see. It gives us the cost of each of these items. Quantities of this equipment are outlined in a similar fashion, so they're also outlined in that inventory that we provided for reference. The Government Code also requires us to let our governing body know of any military equipment that we intend on purchasing in the next year. So in this year, we intend on acquiring 1 pepper ball tactical response pistol. Again, that's a compressed air pistol that shoots a paintball round that has OC spray in it, and the reason for getting that would be to expand our less lethal capabilities. Santa Barbara Police Department also intends to acquire 15 Colt M4 carbine rifles. Those Colt M4 carbine rifles would be used to replace older rifles that would be taken out of inventory. So it'd be a 1-for-1 swap on older equipment that needs to be replaced. The Santa Barbara Police Department also intends to maintain sufficient stock of certain military equipment for training standards and operational readiness. The agency will routinely order replacement stock to maintain the levels of equipment enumerated in our Lexipol Policy 707 and in that inventory. So even though we might not have operational uses, as part of best practice, we still train with that equipment to make sure we're proficient in it. Those training rounds are real rounds, and so we will refill those stocks to the numbers that are enumerated in that policy to maintain those levels for operational readiness. And that concludes our report out for 2023 for military equipment.
Thank you. Is there any public comment?
Chair Dozer, we do not have any in-person or online public comment.
Thank you. Commissioners, any questions or comments? Commissioner Rodriguez.
Thank you for that thorough report. So it's good to hear that there's a lot of 0 uses for militarized items, and we want that. We want to have little use, but also really happy when we have items when we need them. I'm thinking specifically the Montecito debris flow when we needed the Bearcats and other items. What is the cost for holding and maintaining these equipment items that are not being used?
I guess that would depend largely on what item you're describing. For the vast majority of these items, it's just shelf life of the item. So once it's purchased, there's no really additional cost that goes into it other than general maintenance on some of the systems. Something like the armored rescue vehicle that you described, that Bearcat, I mean, that's just it's an F-550 Ford chassis. And so that would require the same maintenance that any other larger vehicle would, so oil changes, stuff of that nature. You mentioned a debris flow. Probably one of the largest maintenance costs for that was after that event. We put mud and rocks and branches all in that thing. And so, that'd be an example of a time when that would mean a more sufficient kind of like financial investment to keep it operational. But for most of the equipment on our list, these are mostly weapon platforms that require really nothing as far as maintenance after purchase, other than just general cleaning and the sort of thing that would go into any other weapon system that we have.
And thank you. And does this report include, or possibly will include, multi-agency collaboration? So if there was a situation where you had to call in sheriff or even fire personnel and use militarized weapon, or not weapons, hopefully not, militarized items, would this report include that, or would that be their department report?
We would probably, so we have mutual aid agreements. Actually, if you look in our policy, there's a section in policy section 707 that describes that mutual aid agreement with other agencies. If we were to work with another agency, they would have to fall within our policy and theirs as well if they're in our jurisdiction. And that is something that we report. We would report, and they would probably report as well, since the use occurred between both agencies.
And my last question is, where does body cam fall? Is that not considered a militarized? No.
No. I'm sorry, go ahead, Chief. Yeah.
No.
It doesn't, no.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
I have one follow-up. Could you tell us what percentage of the officers have body cams when they're responding to calls for service?
All of our officers have body cams.
Thank
We
you.
have body cams and in-car cameras.
Anyone else? All right. Thank you, PD. I think you're done. Next agenda item.
Item number 10, Regional Fire Communications Center.
Look, we have 30 whole minutes for that.
No. And we don't have a chief to make it last 30 minutes.
Ready?
Yep.
Good evening. Commission, I'm Brian Fetterman, your Operations Division Chief for the Fire Department. I think every time I come up here following PD, I always say it's a tough act to follow, and that's true. But I'm always thoroughly impressed with the leadership and the dedicated work that the police department does, and so my hat's off to them on behalf of the fire department. Tonight, a quick presentation on just the Regional Fire Dispatch Center and where we're at. It's been a long road to get here. For context, back in October of 2019, the Board of Supervisors, who oversees the county fire department, granted them the authority to move into separation from their current dispatch operations to a regional-based fire dispatch center. And then our city began with the approval of the council, entering into an agreement and negotiations with them to join in that center as a fire department with the other fire departments all throughout the county for a total of 7. And then that was finalized in October of 2021 by our council to go ahead and enter into that agreement based on those terms. And so a lot of work goes into play to make this happen. It's a big transition. So I'm going to try to kind of go over that briefly with you tonight. Once the Regional Fire Communications Center, or the RFCC, started up, the executive team worked on their strategic goals and objectives, kind of their vision and mission for the center and what that would look like. And just a few brief highlights from there. Some key ones is improving the recruitment and retention of staff, and I spoke to their dispatch manager today. They have over a dozen employees that are all from this county, most of which are entering into the dispatch field for the first time, and so that's really exciting to see. The other thing that's is really important to note is that the Board of Supervisors asked that there be a redundant center built. One of the concerns that the Board of Supervisors had is, as you know, with the tunnel area, oftentimes if that is shut down or if there is a disaster in this area, what happens with our dispatching, and is there a capability to move it to the North County? And so they are working on that and working with the city of Santa Maria on having a backup component. The next thing is the governance of how a regional fire communications center will look, and basically the importance of how do we ensure that our interests as a community are heard and executed through that center. There's the Joint Executive Team, or the JEC. That's made up of all 7 fire chiefs that have entered into the agreement. So when there's business plans or budgeting for future budgets, the team, the executive team all works together to work on that agreement. So it's not just the county fire chief who's making the decisions, it's a collaboration that goes into that process. Then there's our regional dispatch manager who ensures the execution and the oversight of that process. That is a Santa Barbara County employee. Sammy Soto is her name, a fantastic individual with a great depth of experience in the fire and EMS world. And then there's the Joint Operations Committee, or the JOC, and that's what I sit on. And then it's all the operations chiefs from every department is represented. And what we're working on are the CAD, or computer-aided dispatch configurations. So what resources respond to what types of calls, what the dispatch process looks like, setting of our performance objectives, radio procedures so that they're all consistent and concurrent throughout the entire county, and then the 8 agreements that are put into writing and policy so that we all ensure that we're following the same process. So the current system today is our fire department receives dispatch communications through the Santa Barbara Police Department Combined Communications Center. So just a little flow chart. If a person, a community member or visitor calls 911 and it comes into our local dispatch center, our dispatchers will have to triage the call and determine if it's a law enforcement based incident or if it's a fire and EMS, or potentially a combination of both. And then also, is it just within our jurisdiction, or does it need to go to a neighboring agency? So like Montecito Fire has their own dispatch center that dispatches for Montecito and Carpinteria. Santa Maria has their own dispatch center for fire. Lompoc has their own, and so does county. And so our dispatch center will need to determine who needs to be notified, and oftentimes there's calls that need us, our fire department, to respond, as well as another agency. So those calls have to be made out or to the ambulance provider to get services in. The difference in the regional center is that calls still would come into our center. The dispatchers would take the call, and if it's a law enforcement based, then they would continue to handle it. And then if they determine that it's fire EMS based, they would transfer it over to the county RFCC, who would then make the determination of the allocated resources that need to go. Our dispatchers would have the ability to stay on the line and monitor that call if they feel it's important, especially if there's a law-based component. This is a quick overview of our city, and what I'll give you is a scenario of a fire kind of in the Riviera area as we would know it today. And one of the things, the technology advancements, and I'll get into it in a minute about computer-aided dispatching and GPS location, is currently today, we do not have the ability to see other fire apparatus or emergency response equipment in the fire and EMS world. And in the Riviera, as a good example, is if we have a fire up here kind of by Station 7, right now you would end up getting Station 7 equipment responding to a fire, Station 3's, downtown Station 1, and Station 72. You'll note that to our west and east, we have a county station in Mission Canyon and Montecito 92. They will not respond to this incident because we can't see them. So we don't know that they're there, and we're not on the same platform. When we move to the regional, let's take that same call. Our Station 7 would go, and 2, but in this case, we would now get Station 92 and Santa Barbara County 15s that would support us in that incident. So the concept in all of this is the closest, most appropriate resource to the patient, regardless of jurisdiction. So when we go into a combined center with all the fire partners, all 7 in the county, we all operate now as one unit. So let's take Montecito has a firefighter that is riding in with the ambulance provider to Cottage Hospital. Once they pick up that firefighter at the hospital and they're traveling back through our city and they're available, if there was a medical emergency 1 block away from them in today's model, we would not be able to dispatch them to that call. In the new model, they would, as soon as that unit is available, they pop up in the GPS. When the GPS is entered into the CAD would find the closest resource available to that call. Again, not looking at the logos on the side of the fire truck or the ambulance, and ensuring that that unit is dispatched to that community member. Again, some of the technology, the computer-aided dispatching that will be done, there will be EMD or emergency medical dispatching, which is also currently done by our dispatchers and do a phenomenal job at that. That will continue to be done under this center. The new addition would be emergency fire dispatching. So much like algorithms and specific questions asked in the EMD criteria, if there's a fire or vehicle accident emergency, it gives specific questions that the dispatcher can ask to the caller. As opposed to my house is on fire, there's some, what is next to it, what's the building type, are all the occupants out of the home, are there any hazards, are there any basements, and those things are inputted immediately into our CAD system in the vehicles, and we can see all those notes in real time and make adjustments from there. The other piece is the GPS, as I mentioned, the closest resource tracking. Right now, all of those units are not talking on the same platform, and when we merge into the new system, they all will be, and so we'll see them in real time. And again, back to the communications, right now, we also don't operate under the same communication channels. If we go to the county as a city entity and we provide service, we switch over to their channel. If they come to us, they switch over to ours. And in this model, once a call is given out, one command or tactical channel will be given to all those resources, and they'll be shared throughout the entire county. Again, back to the JOC's work on sharing response plans, we're trying to work on training models and response plans and equipment layouts on our apparatus to be as like our partners as possible so that we're all operating the same way, and it's not Montecito's way of doing it or the city's way. It's trying to be more consistent and specific across disciplines. And then the integration or implementation of a program called First Watch that'll be in the dispatch center where we can get much more detailed, specific data analytics on our calls. I know some of the previous reports that we've given are a little bit generic. This is going to be much more enhanced to not just when a person says we're responding, but real-time tracking of when the vehicle actually starts moving, and we can see assets and their response times and did the crew put themselves available when they were driving through the city, or did they say unavailable when they went through the city? We'll see all of that in real time. And lastly, to the current status, this is a rendering of what the center will look like. If any of you have seen the current county EOC or Emergency Operations Center, that's the piece to the right. This is being added on to that building. And this was a photo of it as of last week. So it's moving along quite quickly. Even in the rain, they're doing the best they can, putting tarps up and working under it. And the county does expect that they'll take delivery of the building by July 1st of this year.
All right.
And lastly, before I take any questions, I think it is important to note and the appreciation again for our dispatchers in the city of Santa Barbara who do a phenomenal job. And all dispatchers are really unsung heroes of public safety, and I think it's really important to note that. So I'm available for any questions.
Thank you, Chief Fetterman. It's just incredible. Thank you. Is there any public comment?
Chair Dozer, we do not have any in-person or online public comments.
Commissioners, questions or comments? Commissioner Hill.
Push button, okay. Does this rollout is it impacted in any way with the ongoing issues about the EMT between the dispute that is in court between the fire departments and the current, was it AMR? Ambulance service.
I understand your question, I believe. So, no, the direction of the Board of Supervisors was the current or any future providers of the ambulance will be done underneath the RFCC. So that's not delaying the process at all. So the current provider today is AMR, and when we transition over, they will be within that center as well.
All right, thank you.
So are the dispatchers from the other communities moving or to this new site? In other words, do they have dispatchers in Lompoc?
I'm not aware of any of the members that have been hired so far. If they've come from other agencies or not, I'm not aware of that specifically.
So these people, so I just understand, the dispatchers that are going to be in this new facility, aren't they coming from the existing dispatch centers or no?
No, if I'm understanding,
Okay.
the intent of this was never of downsizing any other jurisdictions dispatches or anything like that. Those still have to operate today, and I think as you saw from our police department with 40,000 calls for service, there still is a need and desire, and rightfully so. So this is an increase and an enhancement to what is currently being provided.
It's an increase.
Yes.
Okay. So where do the dispatchers that are going to be in this new building, where are they coming from?
The last report I was told, not the dispatch manager herself, she came from Orange County Fire Authority after 17 years, was transitioned, took this job. There's a handful of supervisors, and then at last I believe there were 16 dispatchers on board going into an academy that were all hired from within this county.
Okay.
And again, many of which have never been dispatchers before at all, so they're coming into the public safety field for the first time.
Thank you.
To follow up on that question, I think you can probably clarify for us. So currently the dispatchers at the police department are receiving 911 calls for fire and police?
So it's the public safety answering point, or the PSAP, that is within this jurisdiction. So when cell phones call, as an example, they're going to a local tower, and that tower determines the location of where the call is going to be sent. And so if I was to call right now 911 from my cell phone, it would go to our local PSAP, and then that call taker would determine, is this a law emergency within the city, or is it a fire and EMS component, and then transfer accordingly.
So this wonderful new center, is it going to be solely for fire, or is it going to also be fire and police maintains its own dispatch?
So the Santa Barbara Police Combined Communication Center will stay in place for police purposes, as well as because they are the primary answering point for our community. This is a fire and EMS only, so county fire and the ambulance provider who are underneath the sheriff's dispatch center are separating out and forming this regional center for fire and EMS only.
Will this center also include North County, or will that be separate dispatch?
No, that will be all. So as of today, all 7 fire agencies and the ambulance provider are all moving into or joining into this center.
Perfect. Thank you, and great answers. Anyone else?
I have a question, and I think you may have mentioned it, but when we have weather emergencies, often our highways are shut down. So if this center, where is this center going to be located? And then what are the provisions in place to respond when personnel are not able to come from North County?
So this is on Cathedral Oaks at Santa Barbara County's headquarters, right next to their Emergency Operations Center. That's the primary dispatch center for the fire and EMS. And the secondary location is in works with Santa Maria to place it there. So, but the full intent was to ensure that there is a backup center within the north that could be moved to quickly.
Thank you, Chief. I think you're free. Okay, we are on our last agenda item, which is Agenda Item 11, and it's an opportunity for our commissioners or staff to share any communications or anything that they've done that they want the public to know about. Commissioner Rodriguez?
Yes, so 3 of us were able to attend the swearing-in ceremony for the new SBPD officers, and that was just beautiful. It's wonderful to see local folks growing up in our community and then signing on to become our law enforcement to serve our community. So that was just. I don't know what you would say. It was moving. I did get a tear in my eye.
Yes.
And then also, I am going to be signing up for ride-alongs for police and fire, and I just want to invite the public that this is open to all of you as well. So if you're curious about the operations of both fire and police, or if you're just curious about what happens in our city, I encourage you to contact both the fire and police departments and asked to be to do a ride-along. I think that's a wonderful way to really connect and familiarize yourself with our departments.
Commissioner Jones?
And speaking of ride-alongs, I did a fire and police ride-along this past Saturday, is that right? Yes. And although I probably would never do that again, both in the same day, it was a long day, but I would definitely be doing that again. And thank you for your words, Commissioner Rodriguez, because it's very illuminating. The folks at Fire and the Police Department were very accommodating and kind and took the time to really just kind of explain things in great detail, which I found very illuminating. And I'm looking forward to having that opportunity again.
Anyone else? All right. Oh, no. Yes for you, Commissioner Hill? Okay. Okay. Then, if there are no objections, we're going to end this meeting of the Fire and Police Commission for March 28th at 5:44 PM. Job well done.